Well, Professor Hill, during your years of advocacy, you coined an important term, gender violence. It covers a great deal of injustices, but would you explain to us what it means?
One of the things that I want people to understand is that we take sometimes a very narrow approach to thinking about gender violence and aggression. It can include emotional violence, it can include economic coercion, it can include, of course, physical violence and psychological violence, actions against an individual. And I think what we have this idea of now when we think about gender based violence is that you have to have broken bones, or you have to have bruises, or you have to
Mm.
have some physical manifestation of the violence against women. But they're all a whole range that can be really devastating to victims and survivors. And I think we need to acknowledge that. And that's the way we want to be able to see the whole of the problem as opposed to, one aspect of it, the physical part of it.
It's those invisible wounds that really do. They have the lasting effects, the generational effects, don't they?
They absolutely have lasting effects. It is intergenerational. One of the things that I think we have to also understand is that it can follow people throughout their lifetimes. And in the book Believing, I talk about how children in schools may start with being bullied, and that can escalate to sexual harassment, sexual assault. It can move on throughout their lifetimes. If there's evidence that those kinds of behaviors and the responses that they get at as young people can impact how they deal with it later on in life. For example, if they go into the workforce or if they go to colleges and universities, it can, what they hear in response to the problems that they face as children will, in many cases, determine whether or not they are going to be able to come forward and complain as adults when they experience it in a workplace or in their
Mm.
homes or
Yeah.
on the streets.
It's about breaking that cycle. Let's talk about the moment that you stepped up. You testified, and at the time you testified, you were bringing up an issue a Senate committee, heck, America had never been faced with, and you were grilled by that committee live on TV. Where did you find I don't know, the chutzpah to show up day after day and speak your truth in a world where that had not existed before then?
It's important to know that I testified that one day, but then the experience continued because I was called upon to explain over and over again why I had testified, why my testimony was important. So it didn't end when I left Washington, D.C. People talk about courage, and I think courage is not something that you have to exhibit once. Sometimes you have to exhibit over and over again to get through. Where did I get the strength? I got it from my family. I got it from a very supportive environment, some colleagues that were very supportive at in my workplace, upbringing in the church. You draw on so many things, including, your history and your understanding that this is a problem that has been going on that other people have experienced. That really sort of gave me a sense of urgency about what I had to do and what I wanted the world to do in response.
I remember hearing the reports that you faced backlash as both a vocal survivor and a Black woman. Do you talk about that in your book?
I absolutely talk about that. Clarence Thomas was actually taking the place of the very first African American justice on the Supreme Court. But his appointment was controversial in terms of what direction he would take in the law with regard to civil rights. That wasn't my issue, that wasn't why I came forward. But I think it's important backdrop to help understand the context in which I spoke. Nevertheless, even though I believed, and I still believe, that what I had to say went to issues of his character and fitness for a position on the country's highest court, his behavior toward me and others in the same workplace were such that I believe that he was not fit to be making decisions that would impact all of us. So but what was particularly troubling to me as a woman who identified as Black, who had worked in civil rights areas, who really grew up understanding the benefit that I had had from civil rights movement and court cases. It was really disturbing when many people in the African American community rejected my testimony. And many thought that even if what I said was true, I shouldn't step forward. I shouldn't have testified against a Black man who was powerful and would be seen as a success story in the African American community. And I write about the fact that there is still that resistance to Black women coming forward to tell about the abhorrent behavior of powerful Black men. I mean, that was the case in the R. Kelly case for years. There was pushback against those women who testified, and it took really almost 3 decades to get a conviction. And actually, the conviction came because a district attorney was willing to take a different process and apply to R. Kelly and charge him on trafficking. What I do when I talk about it in the book is I talk about how you have to deal with racism, this history of racism that we've experienced, to really be able to eliminate gender-based violence fully against women of color. It's not enough to deal with racism, but it is important that we deal with racism because racism overlaps with misogyny when it comes to gender-based violence.
Recently, President Biden apologized to you for what you went through during the committee hearings. Did you feel that it was genuine or an empty gesture as he cleared a path to the White House?
Yeah, apologized. It was 28 years after the hearing. I really wasn't so interested in whether it was evaluating whether it was an empty gesture. What I was wanting at that point, at 28 years of dealing with this myself and processing it for myself, was I wanted him to be forward thinking. Not just apologize for the past, but as someone who was about to run for president, I wanted to hear his commitment to addressing the issue that was still prevalent and harmful in our society. And so I really wanted to hear, I'm sorry about what happened to you, but I understand that it was bigger than you. Now I understand the problem for what it is, that it's something that is plaguing our nation and that it should be a presidential priority.
Do you feel that it is?
I haven't seen clear evidence of that yet. I'm still very hopeful that there will be actions taken that show a real commitment and a willingness to commit resources, to acknowledge the problem what it is for what it is, to commit resources, to understand how it impacts so many different aspects of our lives, whether it's, of course, education and workplace, but it also impacts, our housing opportunities, our safety and security on the street, the criminal justice system, of course, because of the low rate of prosecutions of sexual harassment, or sexual assault and rape cases. So I haven't seen that sort of full look at and full understanding reflected in any policy yet, but I'm still very hopeful.
Let's talk about that. Talking about hopefulness, I remember growing up myself and being told, you can be anything you want to be, a woman is equal, but I think we've all experienced these moments of harassment or coercion in the workplace. And it's disheartening because I continue to hear these stories. So what is wrong with the thought, oh, the next generation will do it better?
Yeah, well, we are raising a generation of people who expect more, and that's a start. But what we're doing is first of all, we're assuming that everybody in the generation understands and feels that everyone should have an equal chance and they shouldn't be inhibited by violent behavior. That's not the case. So not everybody is on board with this idea that, you know, these kinds of behaviors have no place in our institutions. That's one thing. But secondly, what we're doing is we're sending a generation that is expecting more into systems and processes that are stacked against them,
Yeah.
that have been used for years to keep them from coming forward, to keep them from being able to complain. And and so even if they expect more and they want more, what they're finding is that when they're getting into a situation where they have to complain, is that one, nothing is done, or they're not taken seriously, there's no investigation, or they're finding that there is retaliation against them for coming forward. And the stories are in the press today. You know, there have been books written about them. Susan J. Fowler wrote about what was happening in the tech industry. I think the Hollywood industry had its, you know, it was a lead in the Me Too movement because the processes have failed. And that is true whether we're talking about our civil cases or things that are going on in companies, or whether we're talking about the criminal justice system.
Let's just talk about the basic language and how that plays an important role, and something that we heard about a lot a few years back, where the way we perceive something with gender violence is not being so bad. Like you mentioned before, there's a lot of different layers, or the term boys will be boys. I know that's a term that we've gotten a lot of focus on lately. What damage does this do, and how can we change it to help?
Well, let me just tell you a story. I get a lot of emails, and a lot of emails from different organizations that are representing individuals who have been abused or harassed or violated in any number of ways. And I got one from an organization representing girls saying why we need Title IX. It was written by a girl in elementary school, and she said that her first experience with sexual assault was when she was in the first grade. So she told her teacher, and the teacher ended up suspending this girl's recess privileges because the teacher said the girl was being inappropriate in talking about what had happened to her. So think about what kind of damage that does to a child. A child that begins to believe that you will be punished if you talk about your experiences, if you tell the truth about your experiences. They learn not to trust the system, not to trust adults to protect them. They learn to internalize it. And you know what? It's also telling the boy that abused her that it's okay for him to behave in this way and nothing will be done. There will be no circumstances or any kind of consequences. So what we're doing is that we're grooming people not to come forward, not to trust our system, not to trust even their own feelings of hurt. And so we have got to, as a culture, deal with the cultural messages that we are sending people, because the same people will say to that girl when she's 25 years old and gets harassed in the workplace, they'll say, why didn't you come forward?
Yeah.
Why didn't you come forward? So as though it's her, she's the blame for the problem. And
Mhm.
so we've got there's work to be done, really, in terms of the language that we use and the message that we're sending to our children.
You had mentioned also in the book that you at one time were young and patient, and now you've run out of patience with addressing this issue. Enough is enough.
Well, and I've said because I'm older. And I'm starting to see how two things have given me impatience. That's the way to phrase it. First of all, we know so much more now. We have gone through Me Too. We understand what is happening out there. The figures of 1 in 4 women will be sexually assaulted when they go to college, or over their lifetimes, half, maybe as many as half women will be harassed in the workplace. Uh, you know, that 1 in 4 women will experience intimate partner violence. Those figures are there, the data is there, but we also have the experiences. We've got 19 million tweets from the Me Too movement to describe what those experiences are. We know more. We have researchers who have put in time and effort into understanding the problem and have given us a sense of what we have to do about it. So I'm part of it, what that information is giving me hope. We've learned more, we know more, and we know more about the harm. But I'm also impatient because we could do more, and we aren't. We are not looking at this as the crisis that it is. A
Yeah.
crisis that's not just affecting survivors and victims, it's affecting all of us. It's affecting our families, our communities, and it's affecting our nation. If you look at the kinds of complaints that are coming, let's say from our military and our armed forces, the behavior that is going on inside those the organizations, and all really of all of the institutions that you can name: colleges, universities, workplaces, churches. So this is what makes me impatient. It's a combination of things. It's a combination of the good things that have happened over the last few years and the very horrible things that are still going on.
Before I
And
let you,
AIDS. And
oh,
AIDS.
and
I'll
Abe.
have forever.
And I mean, it's true. It does great after the years of seeing it. What can we do? What are the solutions moving forward? Both, what can our country do? What can we do individually?
Well, first of all, and I do talk about children a lot because I think we've got to start giving different cultural responses, even to children. And we've got to stop saying to ourselves, these things don't happen at an early age, or it's just child's play, or it's just harmless behavior. And we certainly have to stop telling girls that when a boy does something that's hurtful to them, that means that they like them.
Oh,
So we have got to start with our own language, our own cultural perceptions of how important this problem is to our well-being. We've got to learn to support people who have these experiences of violence wherever we find them. But the schools, we have to make these issues known to the schools, that it's the school's responsibility when there are children in those spaces to keep them safe, whether it's the schools, elementary schools, secondary schools, or universities. We've got to, as parents, as alums, as donors, put pressure on those institutions to make sure they change. We also need to make this a political issue.
yeah.
This is an issue that's facing every part of our government system. And I already talked about our military. So we have got to move to understand that we have a role in urging our political leaders to respond to this issue. And so that's, I think we can act in our own homes, in our own communities, in our schools and churches and other places of worship. But we also have to act on the larger scale to move our leadership in this country, because the leadership can set the tone for the rest of the nation.
And that's when we have to make our voices heard. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate taking the time to talk with us about your book, but everything you've done with advocacy and working to fight for this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for hearing me.